Welcome to Module 13, where I will introduce to you the development of agriculture over the last 10,000 years and the positive and negative impacts it had on human biology and health. So, let's get started. It is tempting to think that human evolution stopped once modern Homo sapiens evolved and migrated all over the world, but there is both anatomical and genetic evidence that this is not the case at all. Consider, for example, our teeth. Many humans today have crooked teeth that can be straightened with orthodontics. Of course, early hominins could not have worn braces, but a close look at their teeth reveals that there is plenty of space in their mouths for a full set of straight teeth. Tooth crowding and malocclusion, like that shown in the bottom image, is a recent and common problem today. Well, why? In the last 10,000 years, humans have shifted from a diet of wild plants and animals to a diet of domesticated plants and animals. Most humans have shifted from a hunting-gathering lifestyle to one that relies on agriculture. Foods are processed more than ever before, making them softer and easier to chew and digest. As a result, our chewing muscles and the underlying bone do not grow as large or as robust as they used to be. However, our teeth continue to grow as though there was plenty of space for them, resulting in many humans having too little room for their teeth, and hence overcrowded, crooked teeth. Our biology has been strongly affected by the dietary and behavioral trends of the last 10,000 years. In other words, we have continued to evolve. In this module, we will look closely at the last 10,000 years and how the adoption of agriculture and the expansion of populations have shaped our biology. We will look first at the origins of agriculture and consider when, where, and why humans first domesticated plants and animals. We will look at the archaeological and skeletal evidence for the impact agriculture had on our living circumstances and on our biology. We will then consider some of the important forces shaping human biology still today, and we will consider the question of whether humans are still evolving. Up until about 10,000 years ago, all humans around the world were hunters and gatherers. They collected a wide variety of plants, hunted game, both large and small, fish, and collected shellfish. But at the transition of the Pleistocene to the Holocene, which is defined as a transition period called the Neolithic, humans began to domesticate some of the local plants and animals. This, of course, did not happen overnight, and shown here is an illustration of the gradual shift from a hunter-gatherer lifestyle to one that relies on agriculture. This shift from gathering plants to growing them has had a profound impact on our biology. The process of domestication is actually quite simple. Humans deliberately chose certain variants to grow based on favorable characteristics, such as plants with soft outer coats, more easily digestible, or with larger seeds that were more favorable or had more calories. Eventually, many of these domesticated plants and animals grew to rely on human intervention to survive and reproduce, resulting in a completely dependent and mutualistic relationship between humans and our domesticated crops and animals. Why do we start growing our own food after hunting and gathering it for the last several million years? In a few words, scientists don't really know why we started engaging in agriculture. However, as with other major evolutionary events, the climate most certainly played a role. Shown here is the global temperature over the course of the last 100,000 years. Notice that during most of that time, the climate was cooler, drier, and highly variable. In such conditions, it would have been difficult for crops to grow consistently, given the rapid fluctuations in local environments. However, starting around 10,000 years ago, Earth emerged out of the last glacial cycle or ice age and became warmer. Perhaps more important, it became more stable. This stability meant that local climates were predictable, and humans could more easily rely for survival on what they grew from year to year. There's evidence that around this same time, humans began selectively to gather the wild grass teosinte, shown at the bottom left, that had larger and larger seeds, the beginning of maize domestication. The tool shown at the bottom of the slide is an antler with blades inserted into it, which was used by Neolithic humans to harvest wild plants. But domestication does not happen without people, and there's evidence from all over the world that population growth may have triggered domestication. As populations grew, humans could no longer support themselves with hunting and gathering techniques. They needed more food, and deliberately growing it, storing it, and controlling its distribution not only allowed populations to grow, but encouraged these populations to become more anchored to a piece of land. Village life, with permanent settlements, began to appear in the archaeological record around this time. Much of this lecture has to do with what Neolithic people ate, but one question might be asking yourself is, how do we even know what they ate? Certainly, plant and animal remains discovered at archaeological sites help reconstruct diet, but they do not necessarily indicate the relative importance of different foods in the diet of past humans. In the 1970s, scientists discovered a new way of using ratios of stable carbon isotopes found in the teeth and bones of Neolithic humans to reconstruct diet, and dietary changes, such as a shift from hunting and gathering to agriculture. Carbon exists in three different forms or isotopes: carbon-12, carbon-13, and carbon-14. The number indicates how many combined protons and neutrons each isotope has. Carbon-14 is radioactive and can be used for dating. Carbon-12 and carbon-13 are stable and are incorporated into the plant tissues in the form of CO2, or carbon dioxide, during photosynthesis, as shown in the image on the left, and then into the teeth and bones of humans who eat these plants. Not all plants take in carbon-13 during photosynthesis, however, and therefore the ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-13 in preserved remains can be used to reconstruct diets. For instance, corn does take in carbon-13 during photosynthesis, and a shift to a corn-based diet in Eastern North Americans can be detected in the skeletal remains of humans using the carbon isotope ratio shown on the graph at the right. This shift happened about 1,000 years ago and fueled the development of complex societies collectively called the Mississippian. We can see this, the site of Cahokia in modern-day Illinois, at the bottom right. Archaeological evidence also shows that domestication did not start in one place and spread. Instead, it took hold independently in at least 11 regions around the world. Certainly from these central areas, the idea spread quickly through a process called diffusion. The only region that did not adopt agriculture was Australia. The 11 epicenters of plant domestication are shown on this map. Notice that in each region, different plants, locally found, were domesticated, like maize in Central America, sunflowers in North America, wheat in the Middle East, and bananas in New Guinea. Notice too that domestication did not happen all at once, but took time to diffuse, with Southwest Asia being the first region to yield evidence for domestication, and the eastern United States and Sub-Saharan Africa being some of the last regions. Domestication appears to have begun in a region called the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, followed soon after by evidence for plant and animal domestication in Central and South America and in China. Again, this did not happen overnight. The archaeological and genetic evidence finds that Neolithic humans in the Middle East, for instance, were harvesting wheat and barley for part of the year, and then hunting and gathering for the rest of it. At some point, these peoples noticed that the seeds that fell off the wheat and barley made new wheat and barley plants. Their selection of particular seeds to deliberately plant started a long and continuing practice of controlling the life cycle of plants. As humans grew more and more food, these resources could support more and more people. But these resources were not necessarily mobile, and humans began to settle into more permanent communities called villages. Soon after, these villages grew in size and developed into cities. One of the earliest of these is illustrated here, Çatalhöyük in Turkey. The archaeological record reveals that Neolithic humans were farming in Turkey by about 10,000 years ago. Soon after, villages emerged with closely spaced living spaces, shown on the bottom right, reconstructed as seen in the top image. At the upper right are skeletal remains of a pregnant female and her unborn fetus from Çatalhöyük. These skeletons can reveal what life was like for these early farmers. Agricultural origins are often focused on the Middle East, the so-called Fertile Crescent, but it is important to recognize that Neolithic humans all over the world began to plant seeds and grow their own food. In China and Southwest Asia, for instance, people domesticated rice by 8,000 years ago. In Mexico, corn was domesticated around that same time. This idea spread throughout the Americas, quickly reaching the American Southwest and eventually making it all the way to the Atlantic coast by about 1,000 years ago. There is little evidence that the corn itself was moved from Mexico to these other places. Instead, the knowledge of how to grow corn spread from community to community. The same thing happened in Europe as the domestication of wheat and barley, which began in the Middle East, spread to Greece by 8,000 years ago, and into Western Europe. We have neglected to mention the domestication of animals in this whole process. In fact, the very first thing domesticated was probably not a plant, but an animal, the dog. There's evidence that humans domesticated the local wolf by about 15,000 years ago, and some evidence dates it back to over 20,000 years ago, leading to dogs that were helpful in hunting and guarding. Eventually, wild cattle, sheep, and pigs were domesticated for their meat, milk, and their coats. One cannot overstate the importance of domestication. It allowed humans to grow enough food to sustain a massive population growth at the beginning of the Holocene. This population boom continues today. 2/3 of all calories and protein intake comes from cereal grains like wheat, barley, corn, and rice that were domesticated in the early Holocene. Rice alone accounts for 50% of the caloric intake of nearly 2 billion humans. Domestication has led to the establishment of permanent human settlements, villages, cities, and whole societies. Many of the great civilizations of the past in China, Egypt, South America, and Mexico were fueled by agriculture, and agriculture has driven many technological innovations that allow us to grow, store, and transport more and more food to a growing population. It is therefore tempting to think that agriculture has been nothing but a positive innovation. However, there are always trade-offs, and domestication is no exception. Notice in the top graph how the population has skyrocketed since the start of agriculture 10,000 years ago. This is known as the Neolithic demographic transition. The greater availability of grains cooked into soft mushes allowed mothers to wean their offspring earlier, allowing them to have more offspring and ultimately higher fertility over the course of their lives. Before the advent of agriculture, it is estimated that there were about 2 or 3 million humans, but only 8,000 years later, there were 100 times as many humans, close to 300 million. And today, there are over 200 times as many humans as 2,000 years ago, 7 billion. There are consequences for this many people crammed into a limited amount of habitable space. The utilization of land to grow food to sustain our growing population has led to soil erosion, overgrazing, and deforestation, as shown at the bottom right image. This is not new. Landscapes were being altered around the Mediterranean 6,000 years ago, and this modification of our world continues today. There is one more negative byproduct of the Neolithic demographic transition that we should examine before moving on: violence. Growing populations led to more competition for resources, and which resulted in more violence and organized warfare for access to land useful for growing food. This is not to say that humans were all peaceful prior to the Neolithic. However, there is some archaeological evidence that interpersonal conflict increased in frequency. Skeletal evidence for this warfare can be seen on this slide. At the top left are cranial depression fractures caused by a blunt force trauma. The upper right skull has cut marks that are consistent with scalping. The bottom left skeletal remains are victims of a conflict in Iran in the 9th century BC. The bottom right skull received a fatal puncture during a late medieval battle in England. Your text documents other examples of interpersonal violence in the Puebloan region of the American Southwest at an archaeological site called Cowboy Wash. Let's briefly review before we discuss some of the biological changes we see in human populations as a result of agriculture. There are always trade-offs in biology and in evolution. By domesticating plants and animals and controlling their growth and production, more humans can be fed, leading to an increase in our population. In places, this led to a food surplus, which can be used to feed those who are in need. Long-term food storage allows us to feed ourselves during the unstable years in which excessive rain or drought reduces the crop yield. However, the astounding growth in our population has led to a strain on the environment, We humans have exploited our landscape and altered it so that we can either live or grow food on it. Competition for valuable fertile land has increased, leading to conflict. Humans have also altered the landscape enough to render many other plants and animals extinct, leading to an overall decrease in biodiversity. Let's look more closely now at the impact the transition to agriculture has had on our biology. There is a common misconception that human evolution ground to a halt with the Upper Paleolithic modern Homo sapiens. This is entirely false. Human evolution has continued, and our biology has changed since the late Pleistocene. Much of that biological chain has been driven by the advent of agriculture and other changes related to our diet. For example, let's look at some of the changes that have happened to our skulls and faces. A general trend that we can trace from about 2.5 million years ago to the Holocene is a general reduction in robusticity of the chewing muscles in the teeth. The early transition from Australopithecus to Homo is related to the increased use of stone tools and an incorporation of more meat into the diet. The latest part of this trend, the Neolithic, may be related to the dietary adoption of domesticated plants. This is known as the mascatory functional hypothesis. As humans began to eat soft-textured agricultural foods like millet, the chewing musculature has been reduced. The softness of grains was further increased by cooking them in pottery containers, like the one at the bottom left, until they were soft mushes that did not need to be mechanically broken down by a strong mascatory system. By reducing the activity of the temporalis and masseter chewing muscles, the bones of the face and skull undergo less strain, grow less, and produce a skull that is more globular, with a less projecting face. The less projecting face results in less room for the teeth, leading to an increased rate of malocclusion. In this way, our culture, domestication of plants and cooking vessels, has had a direct impact on our biology. Because the size and position of our teeth is determined by our genetics and less influenced by the food we eat, there is a mismatch between our large teeth and our small, gracile faces. This mismatch is so severe that the absence of dental care can lead to molar impaction, infection, and even death. There is thus selection for individuals with fewer teeth, and as predicted, more individuals today have congenitally absent wisdom teeth than ever before. Before we move on to changes in the postcranial skeleton related to agriculture, let's review the skull. Notice the differences between hunter-gatherers and agriculturalists. These are not universal differences, but general tendencies that characterize these two populations of modern humans. Keep in mind that these differences are entirely related to diet and do not reflect any phylogenetic connection of one group or another to earlier humans. One thing to consider is whether you would have developed a larger, more robust mandible and a longer cranial vault had you been raised in a hunter-gatherer group. The experimental evidence on primates fed different diets shows that the answer to this question is probably yes. You would look quite different had you been raised in another way, eating a different diet. It is quite easy to reconstruct the activity patterns and workloads of modern human hunter-gatherers. All one has to do is study them. In fact, in the 1960s, Richard Lee and Irvin DeVore organized a conference in which anthropologists gathered to discuss the life of a hunter-gatherer. What they determined was that hunter-gatherer life depended very much on the ecology and the kinds of foods being sought. Hunter-gatherers unquestionably worked hard to survive, but there is leisure time as well, like that shown for the coon. But how does one reconstruct what life was like for Neolithic peoples and the early agriculturalists? How can we reconstruct activity patterns from skeletal remains? One tool physical anthropologists use to reconstruct the life of Neolithic humans is called biomechanics. Because bones are somewhat plastic during development, their shape can be strongly influenced by the activity patterns of the growing individual. Larger, thicker bones, for instance, tend to reflect higher levels of activity. More specifically, biomechanists use a principle of an I-beam to reconstruct ancient activity patterns. Material that is farther away from the center of the bone is stronger, it resists bending, than material closer, in much the same way that a ruler can very easily be snapped in half by bending it in one direction along the flat edge. but it is much stronger in resistance to bending along the other axis, perpendicular to the flat edge. So in this image of the femur, it is stronger in the up and down direction, since there's more bone farther from the center, than in the side-to-side direction. This suggests that this individual is doing more strenuous activity that bends the bone in one direction compared to the other. So, what has been found? Researchers have discovered that the transition from hunter-gatherers to agriculturalists resulted in a significant decline in bone strength. What is illustrated here is a comparison of the cross-section of the humerus and femur in two places between hunter-gatherers and early agriculturalists from the southeastern United States. We met these early agriculturalists at the very beginning of the first lecture. Notice that these early prehistoric farmers from Georgia had considerably thinner bone than hunter-gatherers, reflecting reduced mechanical stress and a lower overall activity pattern. This pattern of reduced femoral robusticity can be seen in the bottom graph as well. In addition, it has been found that humans reduce their bone mass as a result of their smaller size. Of course, this depends on the local environment, but in general, humans have had a 10% decrease in body weight in the last 20,000 years. As a result of agriculture, we did not get bigger, we got smaller. The reduced activity patterns has also led in some populations to a reduction of degenerative joint diseases like osteoarthritis. Excessive stress on joints from carrying, lifting, in fact, any physically demanding activity can break down the protective joint cartilage over time and lead to excess bony growth. This happens most often in the spine, hands, knees, and hips. Shown here is the osteophytic lipping or spurs that can form from arthritis of the lower back. These pathologies are often found in skeletons of individuals who are quite active. Of course, for some individuals, the shift to farming dramatically increased their workload, and osteoarthritis is rampant in that population. As we've already seen, agriculture and population increase are intimately connected. Linked to these changes in human life in the Neolithic is a shift from a migratory lifestyle to a sedentary one. These changes have led to humans living in densely populated, unsanitary conditions, such as the image on this slide from Mumbai or Bombay, India. This overcrowding is a recipe for the spread of infectious diseases, and human evolution has been strongly shaped in the last 10,000 years by our exposure to these diseases. One way we know that early Holocene agriculturalists were exposed to many infectious diseases is to study the bones. Infections, such as those caused by the bacterium Staphylococcus aureus, can affect bone growth, causing a swollen region called a periosteal reaction. Though the bones indicate there was an infection, it is difficult to determine precisely what caused this. Nevertheless, periosteal reactions are extremely rare in pre-agriculturalists, but more common in the Neolithic and more recent skeletal remains. Other infections, like the one on this slide, not only show up on bone and are thus detectable in ancient populations, but signal the precise cause. These lesions on the skull are often accompanied by leg bones that are enlarged and bowed. What causes this? A group of diseases called treponematosis, which can include syphilis and yaws. Other diseases found in the skeletal remains of Neolithic humans include tuberculosis, measles, mumps, cholera, influenza, and smallpox. There is a common tendency to think that these diseases were not present in the New World and were only introduced through the colonization of the New World by Europeans in the 1400s. However, there is skeletal evidence that many of these diseases were, in fact, present in overcrowded regions of the New World before Europeans arrived. One of the negative results of eating domesticated plants is an increase in dental caries or cavities. Many domesticated plants are rich in carbohydrates, which support the growth of bacteria like Streptococcus mutans and Lactobacillus acidophilus, shown in the far right image. These bacteria produce lactic acid, which literally dissolves the enamel of the tooth. Of course, cavities aren't mere nuisance to those today who have dental care. However, for Neolithic humans, dental caries could lead to gum infections that could ultimately be fatal. Certainly, some foods are richer in carbohydrates than others. For instance, rice tends not to cause cavities, but corn does. Look at the graph at the bottom left of the slide. Archaic, early, and middle woodland North Americans lived earlier than 1,000 years ago and had not yet domesticated corn. Notice the low levels of cavities. However, around 1,000 years ago, corn was domesticated in these areas, and the late woodland, Mississippian, and contact periods preserved skeletons from a very large percentage of individuals with cavities. There is a common misconception that the shift to agriculture improved nutritional health. It did not. Domestication of plants and the adoption of farming leads to a narrowing of the types of plants and animals consumed by a population. There is evidence that agriculturalists eat a very specific food in a given region: rice in Asia, wheat in Europe, millet or sorghum in Africa. Of course, other foods are consumed, but the variety does not approach that eaten by hunter-gatherers. Without the variety, agriculturalists are at risk of nutritional deficiencies. For instance, corn is lacking in 3 amino acids, and a person existing on a diet almost exclusively of cornmeal will have growth deficiencies as a result. Also, corn contains phytate, which can prevent the body from absorbing iron, causing iron deficiencies. So how do we know if these early agriculturalists had growth deficiencies? If an individual is in nutritional distress, the body growth slows or ceases entirely. This is most obvious in the teeth, where amyloblast cells that make enamel will halt production in times of nutritional stress. This creates lines on the teeth like the ones shown on this juvenile skull, called enamel hypoplasias. These are often caused by nutritional deficiencies, though severe infections can also be the cause. Just a moment ago, we discussed how corn can inhibit proper iron absorption. Iron deficiencies can also be caused by the lack of citric acid found in fruits, which helps absorb iron. The most common source of iron, however, is meat, and an iron deficiency may signal a lack of meat in the diet. Iron deficiencies can also be caused by infection, such as the hookworm, shown on the upper right image, which anchors to the intestinal wall and literally sucks the blood of the host individual, causing iron loss and anemia. When iron is deficient, the body responds by making more red blood cells. This leaves a mark on the skeleton. Since the marrow-producing regions of the body, especially in the skull, become more porous to increase the surface of blood cell production. This results in a porous texture in the top of the skull, called porotic hyperostosis, shown in the bottom left image, and a projection of spongy bone into the eye orbits, cribra orbitalia, at the bottom right. These skeletal indicators of iron deficiency are quite rare before the Neolithic and appear in many skeletal populations after the advent of agriculture. Let's review. Examine this slide closely and note that the many skeletal changes that accompany agriculture. What this means is that we can use the bones of Neolithic people to reconstruct their lives and the challenges they faced. As humans shifted from hunting and gathering to farming, their bodies changed. Dietary changes led to dental crowding and a rounder, more gracile skull. Dietary changes cause occasional nutritional stress, as evidenced by enamel hypoplasia. High carbohydrate diets resulted in an increase in dental caries and/or iron deficiencies that manifested themselves on the skulls and orbits of skeletal remains. Infectious disease transmission increased as a result of overcrowding, with some infectious diseases like syphilis and tuberculosis leaving their mark on bone. Finally, the laborious task of farming increased the risk of degenerative joint disease, for some leading to osteophytic lipping on the shoulder, knee, and lower back. Let's finish our discussion of agriculture with a basic question. Given the cost involved, why do we do it? Compared to hunter-gatherers, agriculturalists have a higher rate of periosteal reaction, infection, more cavities, more nutritional deficiencies, resulting in reduced child growth and development, more enamel hypoplasias, more anemias, and lesser adult height. This last statement is surprising to many, but the skeletal record shows a decline in the height in Neolithic humans compared to hunter-gatherers. If agriculture was so bad for us, why in the world did we adopt this new form of food acquisition? Let's recall that evolution is about survival and reproduction. Agriculture may be problematic for some, but is not so bad that individuals cannot survive, for the most part. But as we mentioned earlier, agriculture has allowed women to be more sedentary, have a stable food supply, even if it is nutritionally wanting. to wean earlier and to ultimately to have more offspring. This increase in female fertility is the reason agriculture has been so successful. It has led to an increase in the human population from just a few million to over 7 billion.